Mallory Bennett, my husband's older sister, dropped a printed incident log beside my plate and held out her hand for my house key. "You have 48 hours to leave," she announced across the Sunday table as my husband, Nate, stared at his dinner. "I am Claire Bennett, 35, an occupational therapist, and for 7 years I had swallowed Mallory's insults because I loved Nate and believed keeping peace protected our marriage. But this was different. The pages accused me of isolating Nate, forcing a sale, and manipulating his grieving family, supposedly according to several relatives. Then I saw a sentence I had written only in a private text to my husband, stripped of context and turned against me. I kept the key and photographed the pages. I was done defending myself against summaries. From then on, I wanted names, dates, and original messages. Then Nate asked me to stay at a hotel for a couple of nights. My own husband had begun to think removing me was reasonable. That thought followed me until the last relatives left. Then I asked Nate to sit with me at the kitchen table. Mallory's incident log lay between us. Nate Bennett, my husband of 7 years, rubbed his face and said he did not want another fight. I told him I was not asking for one. I wanted names. If Aunt Ruth had complained about me, I wanted to hear what she had actually said. If someone believed I was forcing a sale, I wanted to know who had said it and when. Nate admitted that his older sister, Mallory, had collected most of the complaints herself. He had not spoken directly to several relatives she claimed were worried about me. My husband had accepted a verdict without checking its sources. I pointed to the sentence taken from my private text, where I had written that I could not keep living with every family decision becoming a test of loyalty. Mallory had turned it into proof that I wanted Nate isolated from his family. I asked how she had seen it. Nate said he might have shown her part of our conversation after an argument, because he needed someone to talk to. He could not remember exactly what he had shared. I could. The dates on Mallory's log stretched back months, long before the estate dispute became urgent. I stopped trying to make Nate understand how betrayed I felt. I photographed every page, emailed the images to myself, and wrote down when Mallory had handed them to us. If my marriage had been feeding her material, I was done supplying it. The next day, I went to work at the rehabilitation hospital after almost no sleep. As an occupational therapist, I was trained to notice small inconsistencies before they became dangerous. During lunch, I searched my message history with Nate for phrases from Mallory's document. A joke about needing one weekend without family obligations had become, "Claire wants Nate separated from us." A text asking everyone to delay decisions until the estate paperwork was clear had become, "Claire is blocking the sale." I made a simple list in a notebook, original phrase, date, context, Mallory's version. That evening, the Bennett family estate group chat vanished from my phone. Nate confirmed Mallory had removed me because everyone needs space. I asked whether he had objected. He said he had told her not to make things worse. Neutrality, I was beginning to understand, always seemed to cost me something. Aunt Ruth Bennett called. Nate and Mallory's 66-year-old paternal aunt usually avoided disagreement at family gatherings. She asked whether I was really trying to keep older relatives away from the house. I asked what she meant. Ruth said Mallory told her I wanted the place cleared so I could control what happened next. I wanted to defend myself, but I asked one question instead. "Who told you I said that?" Ruth hesitated, then admitted Mallory had, because Mallory said everyone else already knew how I felt. I asked whether Ruth had ever heard those words from me directly. She had not. After we hung up, I wrote her answer down exactly. For the first time, I could see a pattern. Mallory was carrying accusations from person to person, collecting their reactions, then presenting those reactions as if they had begun independently. The next morning, the danger stopped being social and became something I could hold. Nate left a document on the kitchen counter before work and said Mallory wanted us to consider it calmly. It was a temporary occupancy agreement. The language sounded almost kind. I would leave the upstairs unit voluntarily while estate matters were resolved. My belongings could remain temporarily. Then I reached the sentence that made my hands go cold. My voluntary departure would allow the property to be evaluated and transferred without an occupancy dispute. I asked Nate what transfer they were talking about. He said Mallory was only gathering options. I asked whether there was already a buyer. He said he did not know. I pointed to the wording. Nate told me I was reading the worst possible meaning into everything. I refused to sign. He said that refusal would only convince Mallory I was obstructing the family. That was when I understood the trap. If I left, they could call it voluntary. If I stayed, they could call me difficult. If I asked questions, The questions became proof that I was controlling. After my shift, I called an attorney whose name a coworker had once given me. I read the exact language and explained that Nate and I had been living upstairs while helping maintain the property during his father's final year. She could not assess my rights without reviewing the estate and property documents, but she advised me not to sign anything I did not understand and to preserve every written communication. I photographed the agreement, saved it in 2 places, and moved copies of my tax records, repair receipts, insurance papers, and pay stubs into a separate folder. None of it proved Mallory's plan yet. It meant my memory would not be the only record if everyone later claimed things had happened differently. That night, I asked Nate for one promise: no signature on any sale document until there had been a neutral appraisal and he understood exactly what was being proposed. Nate said Mallory believed I was trying to control decisions that belonged to him and his sister. I told him I was asking why his sister wanted me out of our home before anyone could explain what transaction existed. He said the 2 issues were separate. I asked how he knew. He had no answer. Then he admitted there was an estate meeting scheduled in 4 days. Mallory had told him it would be easier if I did not attend. She wanted him to hear the family's options without outside pressure. After 7 years of marriage, I was apparently outside pressure in the house, where I had spent months helping his father recover and keeping daily life running. I asked Nate what would happen at the meeting. He said he did not know all the details because Mallory was handling most of them. Had he seen an appraisal? No. A listing agreement? No. A purchase offer? Not yet. Then why was I being asked to leave before he even knew what he might be signing? Nate's face tightened. He said he could not keep being put between me and his family. I told him no one had put him there. He walked there every time he gave Mallory our private conversations, accepted her summaries without checking them, and asked me to absorb the damage because confronting her was harder. He stood and paced to the sink. Then he said maybe I should stay somewhere else until the estate meeting was over. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. Nate's father had given it to us when we moved upstairs to help him. I had treated that key as proof I belonged. Now my husband was asking me to disappear so his sister could feel comfortable. I told him I was not leaving voluntarily and I was not signing anything. Then I opened my notebook and wrote, "Estate meeting in 4 days. Mallory wants me absent. Purpose unclear." Nate watched me and asked whether I was documenting him now. I said I was documenting what was happening to me because too many things were already being retold in ways I did not recognize. His phone lit up with Mallory's name. Nate turned it face down. Then he told me why she wanted me excluded. According to Mallory, he could not make an independent family decision while I was in the room. If I stayed beside my husband, I was controlling him. If I stepped away, Mallory became the only person beside him when the papers appeared. I was still inside the house and still holding the key, but I could feel my freedom shrinking around me. In 4 days, decisions about the home I lived in could be made while I was deliberately kept outside the room. The 4 days before the estate meeting stopped feeling like time and started feeling like a hallway narrowing around me. The morning after Nate told me Mallory wanted me kept out of the room, I asked him for one simple thing. Call Aunt Ruth and ask whether she had personally complained that I was trying to isolate him. Nate stood at the kitchen counter and said dragging Ruth into this would only embarrass her. I reminded him that Mallory had already used Ruth's name. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He read the message and said his sister had heard I was pressuring relatives for statements. I had spoken to Ruth once. Somehow Mallory had turned one question into a campaign before Nate had even checked whether the accusation was true. That speed frightened me. Mallory was not merely reacting to conflict. She was getting ahead of anyone who tried to verify her version. That afternoon, Ruth called my cell and asked if we could meet somewhere Mallory would not know about. Ruth Bennett, Nate and Mallory's paternal aunt, usually avoided family disagreements. We met in a quiet coffee shop near my hospital after my shift. Ruth said she did not want to choose sides. I told her I only wanted to see the exact conversation Mallory had described. After a long hesitation, she unlocked her phone. Mallory had written first, telling Ruth that I wanted older relatives excluded from decisions about the house and that I was pushing Nate to sell before anyone else was ready. Ruth had replied that it would be awful after everything her brother wanted. In the screenshot Mallory later showed Nate, Ruth's response appeared alone. The message that planted the idea had been cropped away. I read the thread twice. Mallory had also told Ruth that the others are saying the same thing. Ruth admitted she had never asked who the others were. Later, Mallory forwarded Ruth's shocked reaction as proof that Ruth was worried about me. I asked permission before photographing anything. Ruth let me preserve only the messages about me, and I sent them to the folder I had already started. Then she told me something worse. Mallory had said Nate had already decided I should leave the house until the estate was settled. My stomach dropped. Nate had told me he was only asking me to consider leaving because everyone needed space. If Mallory was telling relatives the decision had already been made, his hesitation was being sold as agreement. I waited until Nate came home. I did not show him Ruth's messages yet. I wanted his answer before he knew what I had. I asked whether he had agreed with Mallory that I should move out. Nate said no. He insisted there had been no decision and no formal plan. Then our shared household tablet chimed on the counter. A calendar notification filled the screen. A state attorney meeting. Thursday, 3 in the afternoon. Nate had told me the day before that the meeting was still being arranged. I looked at him, and he looked at the tablet. He admitted Mallory had confirmed it earlier, and he had not wanted to tell me until things calmed down. I asked what else he had left out. He said nothing important. I asked whether there was already a buyer. After another pause, Nate admitted Mallory had someone she described as serious and ready to move quickly. That was when his lie stopped being about a calendar. My husband had known there was a scheduled estate meeting and a prospective buyer, while I was being asked to sign a document saying I would leave voluntarily, so the property could be transferred without an occupancy dispute. I had spent a day wondering whether I was becoming paranoid. Now the pieces were touching. I showed Nate Ruth's complete thread. He read it and said Mallory might have been trying to simplify what everyone felt. I asked how inventing a claim and cropping out the message that caused Ruth's reaction could be called simplifying. Nate said Ruth got confused when family matters became emotional. Every time a fact contradicted Mallory, someone else suddenly became unreliable. I asked Nate for one boundary: no signature, no sale commitment, and no agreement about my occupancy until there had been a neutral appraisal and complete document review. He said refusing to cooperate would make Mallory think I was controlling him. Hearing her language come out of my husband's mouth hurt more than if he had yelled. The next day, I took my financial records to the attorney I had contacted. I showed her the occupancy agreement, explained the timeline, and told her there was now a prospective buyer. She advised me not to sign anything I did not understand and to preserve records of money I had contributed to the home. That evening, I found receipts for plumbing, paint, and appliance replacement, and months when I had carried more of our shared expenses while Nate helped care for his father. I hated how quickly my marriage had turned into folders, but documentation was the only part of this I could control. When I got home, Nate was sitting on the edge of our bed. He asked if hiring a lawyer meant I was preparing to leave him. I told him it meant I was preparing not to be erased. He said he had asked Mallory for whatever documents she expected him to review, and she had become angry, accusing me of filling his head with suspicion. One question from Nate had disturbed her. Instead of reassuring me, it showed me how rarely he had questioned her before. I told him I did not need him to choose between me and his sister. I needed him to stop letting her decide what was true. Nate said he loved me but could not survive being pulled in two directions. I told him I was standing still. Then he suggested that leaving for a few days might prove to his family that I was not trying to interfere. There it was again, peace purchased with my absence. After Nate went downstairs, I opened Ruth's screenshots beside Mallory's incident log. One phrase kept bothering me. Mallory had described me as isolating Nate from the people who know him best. I had heard nearly the same words years earlier in a Bennett family story about Denise Hall, my late father-in-law's longtime partner after Nate's mother died. According to the version I had been told, Denise became controlling after his stroke and tried to cut him off from the family. I had never met her. I had never questioned the story because everyone repeated it with the same certainty. I searched the county court docket using Denise's name and my father-in-law's. An old case appeared. I read only what was publicly listed: dates, filings, and names. Mallory's name was there in connection with sworn allegations during the dispute. The docket did not prove she had lied then, and I refused to pretend it did. But the wording, the isolation accusation, and the way one story seemed to spread through an entire family were too familiar to ignore. Nate came upstairs and found me at the table. I closed the browser before he saw the page, not because I was ashamed, but because I finally understood how alone I was inside our marriage. He had hidden a scheduled meeting and a buyer because challenging Mallory frightened him more than deceiving me did. The estate meeting was getting closer. Mallory wanted me outside the room, and Nate still would not promise to keep me beside him. Someone was preparing to make decisions about the house, while I was isolated from the people making them. For the first time, I stopped asking how to convince the Bennetts that I belonged. I started asking what had happened to the last woman they decided did not. The question would not leave me alone. The next morning, before my first patient arrived, I reopened the county docket and copied the old case number into my notebook. I did not know whether Denise Hall had been wronged, whether she had wronged the Bennetts, or whether the truth was somewhere between. All I had was a public record, Mallory's name attached to sworn allegations, and language that sounded too much like the words now being used against me. After work, I found a possible current phone number for Denise through public records and called. When a woman answered, I introduced myself as Claire Bennett, Nate Bennett's wife, and said I was calling about an old county case involving his father. The silence went so long I thought she had hung up. Then she asked how I had found her. I gave her the case number and said Mallory was now describing me as isolating, controlling, and financially coercive. Denise Hall had been my late father-in-law's longtime partner, a woman I had heard about for years without ever meeting. She told me she did not want to be dragged back into anything involving the Bennett family. I apologized and said I was not asking her to accuse anyone. I only wanted to know whether the public record matched what had happened to her. Then Denise asked, "Has Mallory started telling people everyone else is already worried about you?" I gripped the phone harder. I said yes. Denise agreed to meet me once in a public place and bring documents. We met the following evening in a diner on the west side of Columbus. Denise was 58 with silver at her temples and the careful posture of someone who did not expect strangers to believe her. Before I sat down, she said she was not there to help me destroy Mallory. I said I was not there to destroy anyone. I needed facts I could verify. Denise opened an old accordion folder and placed envelopes, photocopies, and certified mail receipts on the table. She explained that after Nate's father suffered a stroke, disagreements grew over his care, visits, and who could make decisions. I knew the family version. Denise had supposedly become possessive, kept him away from his children, and abandoned him when the conflict became too difficult. Denise did not ask me to accept her version instead. She showed me registered letters asking to coordinate visits, attorney correspondence challenging claims that she had threatened the family, and a later notarized statement signed by Nate's father, saying he had not asked Denise to disappear from his life. It did not prove every argument had been invented. It proved the neat story I had been told was incomplete. I read slowly, asking Denise where each document came from. She let me photograph the certified mail numbers and a notarized statement, but asked me not to copy several hurdles. Then she handed me a sworn declaration bearing Mallory's name. The words made my skin prickle. Denise was described as isolating him from the people who know him best, creating financial pressure, and making family access conditional on her approval. The language was not identical to Mallory's incident log about me, but it was close enough that I heard the same rhythm. I asked whether Nate knew about these documents. Denise said she did not know what he had been shown. She added that years ago she had believed Nate understood more than he admitted because he rarely challenged his sister. She said it like an old conclusion she no longer had the energy to defend. That hurt because it sounded like my own marriage. I did not leave the diner believing Denise automatically. I left with sources. The next morning, I compared filing dates and document references on the county website with what she had shown me. The registered mail receipts matched the period of the dispute. The notarization date fell after a filing that described Denise as unwilling to communicate. I called the clerk's office to ask how to obtain copies of public filings and paid for what I could legally request. At work, I kept thinking about family dinners when Denise's name had been used as a warning. I had accepted the story because everyone repeated it with the same certainty. I felt ashamed, but shame was not evidence. In my notebook, I wrote only what I could support: old sworn allegation, later notarized contradiction, matching language pattern, incomplete family account. That night, I compared Denise's file with Ruth's screenshots and Mallory's incident log. The strongest pattern was not one accusation. It was the direction of information. Mallory told one person that someone else had a concern, waited for the reaction, then moved that reaction forward as though it had begun independently. I needed to know whether Ruth's conversation was an exception. I contacted 2 relatives named in Mallory's log and asked only whether they would show me the original messages behind statements attributed to them. One refused. The other, Nate's cousin Eric Bennett, agreed to meet in a grocery store parking lot after his shift because he did not want Mallory seeing my car at his house. Eric was 32 and had never been close to me. He opened his phone and searched Mallory's name while I stood beside him. The exchange followed the same shape. Mallory had written that Ruth and 2 others were concerned. I was trying to control the estate process. Eric replied that if that was true, Nate needed to be careful. In Mallory's incident log, Eric's response appeared as evidence that he had independently warned about me. I asked whether he had raised that concern before Mallory's message. He said no. With his permission, I photographed the screen. Then he showed me another message. Mallory told him I was positioning myself to claim money from the house, and that the family needed to make decisions before I created complications. Eric said he assumed Mallory had legal advice because she sounded so certain. I could not prove whether that claim was true, but it connected the campaign to the property again. Nate was waiting when I got home. Mallory had called him. I knew because he said her name before he said hello. He asked why I was contacting relatives behind his back. I told him I was contacting people whose names had been used to accuse me. He said Mallory believed I was intimidating the family into changing their stories. I showed him Eric's original thread beside the excerpt in Mallory's incident log. Nate read them twice and said maybe Mallory had misunderstood Eric. I asked how she could misunderstand a concern she had planted herself. Nate said I was treating every conversation like a courtroom. I told him ordinary conversation had become unsafe. For 1 second, I wanted to comfort him because he looked exhausted. Then I remembered I had spent days being asked to leave my home so everyone else could feel less uncomfortable. The next morning, my attorney called after reviewing the temporary occupancy agreement and the limited estate paperwork I had provided. She told me nothing she had seen, required me to leave voluntarily before an appraisal or proposed sale could be discussed. She was careful. Without the complete estate file and transaction documents, she could not tell me exactly what rights would ultimately apply. But the claim that my departure was simply a necessary procedural step did not appear in the documents she had reviewed. I asked her to request the proposed transaction documents formally, rather than relying on Mallory's summaries. That decision cost money I had not planned to spend, and probably ended my last chance to pretend this was only a family misunderstanding. I authorized it anyway. That call changed the shape of everything. Mallory's cruelty had still been explainable if I was willing to be generous, as grief mixed with control. Now there was a practical result attached to it. If I left voluntarily before Nate understood the transaction, the house could be discussed as though my occupancy were no longer an obstacle. If Nate entered the estate meeting surrounded only by relatives who had been told I was manipulative, every question I raised could become proof of the accusation. I could not yet prove what Mallory ultimately wanted from the sale. I could prove that removing me made the process easier for her. That afternoon, Eric messaged that Mallory had called him after our meeting and that he wanted no further involvement. I thanked him and did not push. Soon after, Ruth texted that Mallory was furious that private family messages were being collected. I backed up every screenshot, scanned the occupancy agreement, uploaded copies to a secure account Nate did not use, and left a paper set in my locker at work. It felt melodramatic. It also felt necessary. That evening, Denise called. Mallory had learned we met. Denise knew because Mallory herself had left a voicemail, accusing her of exploiting a grieving family again. Denise forwarded it after asking me not to share it beyond my attorney without speaking to her first. I listened once. Mallory's voice was controlled and almost polite. She did not threaten Denise outright. She said reopening old accusations would hurt people who had suffered enough. When I finished listening, I understood that Mallory was no longer waiting to see what I had. She was trying to shut down the source. I found Nate in the kitchen. Before I could speak, he said I had crossed a line by contacting Denise. He told me Mallory was devastated that I had dragged their father's worst years into the present. I asked whether he wanted to see what Denise had shown me. Nate said he did not know. That answer hurt more than a refusal. I told him I had documents, not gossip, including a notarized statement from his father contradicting part of the story, repeated for years. Nate pushed back from the table and said I was turning his father into evidence. I said Mallory had already turned his father into a weapon every time she used grief to make questions forbidden. Then Nate said he could not promise to oppose Mallory at the estate meeting. She was his sister, he said, and she had handled family responsibilities for years. I told him I expected him to look at original sources. He said he was tired of living like that. I almost laughed. I had been living this way for less than a week and already understood how unbearable it was. Mallory had spent years making herself the person who summarized difficult things for him. Now checking her summaries felt to Nate like betrayal. I opened my overnight bag and packed enough for 2 days. Nate asked if I was leaving. I told him I was preparing in case someone tried to make the decision for me. I packed my medication, work badge, passport, charger, and document copies. The brass house key stayed on my regular key ring. Then my phone buzzed with an email from Mallory. The subject line read family boundary notice. She wrote that my contact with relatives and Denise was causing emotional harm, that I was to stop interrogating family members, and that I should leave the house before the estate meeting to reduce conflict. Near the bottom, she referred to the buyer's deadline. I read that line 3 times. Mallory had never disclosed a buyer deadline to me. Nate had told me only that someone was serious and ready to move quickly. I asked what deadline she meant. He looked at the email and said he did not know. I asked whether Mallory had sent him paperwork containing a date. He said she might have, but he had not reviewed everything yet. The answer was so familiar that something inside me went quiet. I saved the email, printed it, and added it to the folder. Then I separated copies of Mallory's incident log, Ruth's thread, Eric's thread, and Denise's records. For the first time since Mallory dropped that log beside my plate, I held something stronger than my own defense. I had original sources. I had evidence of a repeated pattern. I had an occupancy agreement tied to a property process I was being pressured to leave before. And now I had a written demand connecting my removal to a buyer deadline I had never been allowed to see. But Mallory knew I had contacted Denise. She knew I was comparing messages. Nate still would not promise to stand beside me. The estate meeting was almost here, and the person who controlled the family story had finally realized I possessed evidence capable of breaking it. I zipped the overnight bag and set it by the bedroom door. The truth was beginning to belong to me, but so was the danger. If Mallory could no longer convince me to leave voluntarily, I had no idea what she would try next to make sure I was gone. The morning of the estate meeting, I woke before my alarm and found Nate sitting on the edge of the bed. My overnight bag was still by the door. Neither of us mentioned it. I dressed for work and left the hospital early for the meeting because I did not trust myself to go home first and be talked out of attending. Nate had stopped asking me to stay away, but he still had not said he wanted me there. When I reached the attorney's office, Mallory was already there with a leather portfolio. Aunt Ruth sat 2 chairs away, twisting a tissue between her fingers. Nate arrived behind me. The probate attorney handling the Bennett estate said there were questions about the proposed property transaction. Mallory interrupted. She said the real problem was that I had inserted myself into a family matter, contacted relatives privately, and reopened painful accusations involving their father. Then she looked at Nate and said the meeting would be more productive if I waited outside. I placed Mallory's incident log on the table and said I would leave if the attorney said I had no legitimate reason to remain for discussion of documents affecting my occupancy. He said that since I had been asked to sign an occupancy agreement tied to the proposed transaction, my questions were relevant. Mallory changed tactics immediately. She said my presence proved Nate could not make an independent decision with me beside him. I did not argue about whether I was controlling. I asked who had first said I was isolating Nate from his family. Mallory said several people had expressed concern. I asked for the first person. She named Ruth. Aunt Ruth Bennett, Nate and Mallory's paternal aunt, looked up sharply. She had already shown me the unedited messages on her phone. I asked whether she wanted to answer for herself. Ruth said quietly that she had reacted only after Mallory told her other relatives were already worried about me. Mallory said Ruth was confusing the sequence. I placed the permitted screenshots beside Mallory's incident log. In the original thread, Mallory's message came first. She claimed I wanted older relatives excluded and that I was pressuring Nate over the house. Ruth's shocked response came afterward. In Mallory's log, only Ruth's reaction appeared. Mallory said one cropped screenshot did not erase months of behavior. I agreed that was why I had checked another source. I showed Nate the thread his cousin Eric Bennett had permitted me to preserve. Mallory had told Eric that Ruth and others feared I was controlling the estate process. Eric responded that Nate should be careful if that was true. His response then appeared in the incident log as a separate family warning. Nate read the pages twice. Mallory accused me of cornering relatives. Ruth said no one had cornered her, and the words on her phone were her own. The room changed. Mallory's greatest advantage, everyone assuming someone else had verified her, began to crack. Another relative checked his phone after recognizing a message Mallory had attributed to Eric. He found that Mallory had contacted him first too. A second thread showed the same pattern. Someone else was blamed first. Then the reaction was treated as independent proof. Mallory stopped defending the sequence and turned toward me. She said I had converted a grieving family into witnesses and evidence. Then she asked Nate whether he was really going to let his wife humiliate his sister over imperfect screenshots. Nate looked at me, then at Mallory. For years, I would have softened my words or offered a compromise that cost me more than anyone else. I stayed quiet. The attorney moved us back to the property. A proposed off-market purchase agreement had been circulated, but no one had to sign that afternoon. Mallory said the buyer's timetable made delay risky, and the family could lose a clean opportunity. I asked for the neutral appraisal. There was none in the packet. Mallory said comparable sales were enough, and a formal appraisal would only slow things down. I asked why my voluntary departure had been presented as necessary before Nate had even seen the full agreement. She said an occupancy dispute could frighten buyers away. Then Mallory looked at her brother. She told Nate their father had trusted the two of them to take care of what he left behind. She said he had spent his final years afraid the family would fracture. And now Nate was allowing me to bring attorneys and Denise Hall into matters that should have remained private. If he refused to move forward, she said, he was choosing my suspicion over his father's memory. Nate's hands shook slightly on the table. He asked whether the agreement had to be signed that day to preserve the offer. The estate attorney said the document contained a response deadline, but Nate was entitled to understand any agreement before signing. Mallory pushed the packet toward him. I did not touch it. I told Nate I was not asking him to choose me. I was asking whether he would sign a property agreement he had not independently verified simply because refusing would upset his sister. For once, the choice was not wife versus sister. It was verification versus obedience. Nate picked up the pen. For one terrible second, I thought he would sign. Then he put it down. He asked the attorney for the complete buyer disclosures, written communications about the offer, and time to obtain an independent appraisal. Mallory stared at him. Nate repeated the request. The attorney nodded. Mallory said Nate was making a mistake. He told her maybe he was, but he wanted to know what he was signing first. It was not a declaration of loyalty to me, but it mattered more. For the first time since Mallory handed me the incident log, Nate refused to let her urgency substitute for information. The relief lasted less than a minute. Mallory said that if everyone insisted on treating her like a criminal, they should at least understand that she had brought the buyer because the company was experienced with older properties. Earlier that morning, my attorney had sent me public business records about the transaction. I took them from my folder. The buyer was connected through management records to a residential investment company. Public filings showed repeated professional connections between that company and Mallory's real estate network. The records did not prove a secret commission or illegal payment, and I said so. But Mallory's convenient buyer was not a random stranger. Nate asked whether she had worked with people connected to the buyer before. Mallory said the Columbus real estate community was small and professional overlap meant nothing. The attorney asked whether any compensation, referral arrangement, representation, or other financial interest involving Mallory had been disclosed in writing. Mallory said she was not acting as the listing agent. He repeated the question. She said there was nothing improper. I did not know whether anything illegal had happened, but speed benefited Mallory. She had pushed Nate toward an off-market agreement with a buyer connected to her business world while calling my request for an appraisal controlling. She had asked me to leave voluntarily while describing my continued occupancy as a complication. Every practical advantage had been wrapped in the language of grief and family loyalty. Mallory turned on me. She said I had poisoned Nate against his own family and was implying financial corruption because I could not stand not being in control. She said the marriage itself had become unhealthy and Nate needed space from me to decide what he wanted. A week earlier, those words would have shattered me. Now I heard the mechanism, accusation, separation, then each reaction recycled as proof. I opened Denise's file. I told the room I had contacted Denise Hall because her name appeared in a public court docket and because language used against her years earlier resembled what was being used against me. Denise had not asked me to reopen anything. I showed only documents she had allowed me to preserve and public filings I had obtained. Mallory's old sworn declaration described Denise as isolating Nate's father, creating financial pressure, and restricting family access. A later notarized statement from Nate's father contradicted important parts of the story I had heard for years. Nate stared at his father's signature. He asked where I got the document. I told him Denise showed it to me. Then I verified the filing timeline through public records. I did not claim to know what his father had felt. I told him only what the document said. His father had not asked Denise to disappear and disputed claims that she refused reasonable communication. Ruth began crying quietly. She said she remembered being told Denise had cut everyone off, but she could not remember who had first told her. Mallory said Denise was vindictive and old documents had nothing to do with the house. I agreed that the old dispute did not prove the current transaction was fraudulent. What it proved was a pattern visible in original sources. A person was labeled isolating and controlling. Family members were told others were already afraid. Their reactions were circulated as independent confirmation. The targeted person was pushed outside the room where decisions were made. I could not know what Mallory believed. The information chain was still visible. Nate asked Mallory why she had cropped Ruth's message. Mallory said she was summarizing. He asked why she had told Eric that Ruth was concerned before Ruth raised any concern herself. Mallory said everyone sensed the tension. Nate asked why she told relatives he had already decided I should leave when he had not. Mallory stopped answering him and told the attorney she wanted the meeting ended. The attorney said no one was signing the purchase agreement that day. The sale would pause while Nate reviewed the documents and obtained independent advice. Mallory stood so quickly, her chair scraped the floor. She told Nate that if the opportunity disappeared, the responsibility would be his. Then she looked at me and said I had finally gotten what I wanted. I had made him distrust his own family. I did not answer. In the parking lot, my body began shaking. Nate followed me to my car. He apologized for giving Mallory our private messages, accepting her claims without checking them, asking me to leave, and hiding the meeting and the buyer. He said he had thought keeping everyone calm was the same as being fair. I told him fairness would have required him to check whether I was being lied about before asking me to disappear. Nate asked me to come home with him and said we could repair this together. Those words should have been the relief I had wanted. Instead, I remembered Mallory reading my private messages because Nate had given them to her. I remembered the calendar notification exposing a meeting he had hidden. Mallory had built the machinery, but Nate had kept opening the door. I told him the off-market process had to remain paused until there was an independent appraisal and complete review. Mallory could no longer receive our private marital conversations. Any property communication affecting me had to be documented. Then I told him that if he could not accept those boundaries, I would separate from him. Nate looked stunned. He said he had just chosen not to sign. I told him one correct choice did not erase all the choices that came before it. My phone vibrated. Ruth had sent a message saying Mallory was already telling relatives that I had ambushed the meeting with Denise's documents and manipulated Nate into stopping the sale. I showed Nate. He closed his eyes. The lie was moving again, but this time it could not travel invisibly. We knew where it started. We knew how it spread. The accusations had never been a chorus of independent voices. Mallory had supplied the fear, collected the reaction, and fed those reactions back to the family as proof. The property deal had given that pattern a deadline and a reward. I looked at Nate and understood that exposing Mallory was not the same as escaping her. The sale was paused. Her authority was cracked. But the final decision was no longer about proving I was innocent. It was about whether I would keep living in a marriage where my safety depended on my husband, finding the courage to question his sister only after she had nearly pushed me out of my own home. For the first time, Mallory's version of reality was no longer controlling the room. Mine was not either. The documents were. And with the truth exposed, there was nowhere left for any of us to hide from what came next. The documents were still spread across my dining table when Nate and I got home. Mallory's incident log sat beside Ruth's screenshots, Eric's messages, Denise's old records, and the property papers that had nearly moved forward while I was being told my presence was the problem. Nate said he wanted to call his sister and tell her to stop. I told him no. I was done with private confrontations. that could be retold 5 different ways by morning. From then on, anything involving Mallory and the house would go through written channels or attorneys. Anything involving my marriage would stay between Nate and me. He asked whether that meant I wanted him to cut his sister off. I said it meant she no longer had access to me. The next day proved why that boundary mattered. 2 relatives texted that Mallory was telling people I had manipulated the estate attorney and dragged an old family tragedy into the meeting to block the sale. One asked me to be the bigger person. Another said Mallory had suffered enough embarrassment. A week earlier, I would have explained every detail until my hands hurt. Instead, I sent one answer. I was not discussing accusations through third parties. Property matters would be handled through the appropriate professionals. Personal contact with Mallory was suspended. Then I muted the family thread. Ruth called that evening and said several relatives wanted a dinner so everyone could apologize and move on. I thanked her for showing me the original messages, but told her forgiveness and access were different decisions. Being Nate's sister did not entitle Mallory to my private messages, my home, or my silence. The property process slowed once no one could rely on urgency alone. My attorney confirmed that the proposed off-market agreement remained on hold while Nate requested an independent appraisal and full transaction review. Nate copied me on every document that affected my occupancy or financial contributions. The appraiser came to the house without Mallory present. I provided receipts for repairs and expenses and let the professionals do their jobs. For the first time, the house was being discussed through records instead of loyalty. Mallory tried one more deadline by emailing Nate that the buyer might walk. Nate forwarded the message to the estate attorney and asked whether any response was legally required that day. The answer was no. He showed me the chain afterward. Nate admitted he had often let Mallory translate complicated matters because checking for himself felt exhausting. I told him easier for him had never meant harmless for me. A few days later, the independent appraisal came back higher than the price in the rushed off-market proposal. I learned that from the written report Nate shared with me. It did not prove Mallory had intended to cheat anyone, and I refused to turn suspicion into fact. It proved that slowing down had protected the estate from making a major decision without basic information. Nate asked the attorney to document any referral, representation, or compensation relationship involving Mallory and the proposed buyer before further discussion. I thought Mallory's silence would feel like victory. Instead, I was exhausted. At work, I still checked my phone between patients. At home, I flinched when Nate's phone lit up. The original sources had answered what Mallory had done. What remained was my marriage. Nate wanted to repair it immediately. He started leaving his phone face up, telling me when Mallory contacted him, and making a visible effort to include me in every decision. I saw that effort. I also saw how badly he wanted effort to erase consequence. One night, he said the worst was over because he had finally stood up to his sister. I told him the worst for him had lasted one meeting. For me, it had included being publicly ordered from my home, finding my private words in an accusation file, discovering a hidden meeting in buyer, and hearing my husband ask me to leave so Mallory would feel comfortable. I had spent days proving I was not what they called me while he waited to see which version of reality caused less conflict. Nate apologized again. I believed he meant it. That was not the same as trusting him. I told him I was moving into an apartment for a while. His face changed as if I had announced a divorce. I said I was not making a final decision about our marriage that night. I was making a final decision about where I would live. I needed a place where no relative could demand my key, where no estate meeting determined whether I belonged, and where silence in the hallway did not feel like a warning. Nate asked what he had to do for me to come back. I refused to give him a checklist he could complete for a reward. I told him what would have to exist before I considered rebuilding: counseling, financial transparency, no sharing our private conversations with Mallory or other relatives, and permanent boundaries around family decisions. Most of all, he had to learn to verify what he was told without waiting for me to prove I was being harmed. Finding an apartment was painfully ordinary, and that helped. I chose a small place near enough to the hospital, with plain walls, a narrow balcony, and a tiny kitchen. When I paid the deposit from my own account, I cried in my car because nobody had to approve my right to live there. I called Denise after signing the lease. She had entered my life first as a source, and I did not want to repeat the Bennett habit of treating someone else's pain as family property. I asked what she wanted me to do with her documents. Denise said I could retain only the records she had already authorized my attorney to reference. She wanted the rest returned. I drove them back to her in the same accordion folder. At the diner, Denise asked whether exposing Mallory had changed the family. I told her Ruth had apologized. Some relatives still wanted peace at any cost. Nate was trying, and Mallory had stopped contacting me. I did not pretend to know what any of them truly thought. Before we left, I apologized for hearing a version of Denise's life for years and never questioning whether she had been allowed to speak for herself. Denise said I had not known her. I told her that was exactly why I should never have believed I knew the whole story. Then I returned the folder. Whatever she chose to do with the old record belonged to her. Moving day came 2 weeks after the estate meeting. I packed clothes, books, kitchen things, and the framed photograph from my college graduation that Mallory once called too sentimental for the upstairs living room. Nate helped carry boxes without turning the day into another argument. When the last load was ready, he stood by the front door of the Bennett house with the brass key in his palm. His father had given that key to us when we moved upstairs to help him during his final year. I had carried it through hospital visits, repairs, late grocery runs, and months when I believed being useful would eventually make me unquestionable. Then Mallory had demanded it from me at the Sunday table, as if she alone could decide whether I belonged. Nate said I did not have to give it back. He said the house was still my home if I wanted it to be. For a moment, I wanted to close my fingers around the key. Keeping it would prove Mallory had failed to drive me out. Then I understood that winning was the wrong measure. If I stayed because the people who had tried to remove me had finally accepted my right to remain, I would still be letting their permission define my home. I took the key from Nate, looked at it once, and placed it on the entry table. I told him I was not leaving because Mallory ordered me to. I was leaving because I had chosen a place where she never got a vote. If Nate and I ever lived together again, it would be because we built something neither of us could hand over to his family when conflict became uncomfortable. He asked whether I still loved him. I said yes. That was the hardest truth. Love had been the reason I endured too much, and I would not let it become the reason I returned too soon. The estate matter continued without me at the center of it. Nate told me in writing that the family would not proceed with the original off-market proposal while the review remained incomplete. I did not ask what Mallory said. My legal interests were handled by my attorney, and the rest belonged to the Bennetts. Nate began counseling on his own before we attended any session together. I appreciated that without treating it as a promise. Some days I missed him so much I almost drove back. Other days I remembered how easily he had asked me to disappear and wondered whether love could survive that memory. I allowed both feelings to exist without forcing either one to become a decision. My first night in the apartment was quiet. No family group chat buzzed beside me. No one waited for me to explain why a boundary was not an attack. I ate takeout on the floor because my table had not arrived and laughed when I realized I had forgotten to buy forks. It was not a glamorous new beginning. It was inconvenient, expensive, lonely, and mine. The next morning, sunlight came through the blinds and fell across unopened moving boxes. My hospital shoes were by the door, ready for another ordinary shift. I picked up the new apartment key from the counter and hung it on a small hook beside the door. The brass Bennett key was no longer on my ring. For years, I had thought a key meant someone had let me belong. I finally understood that the safest door in my life would be the one I could close without asking anyone's permission.